What if the teachings of Jesus were never meant to be taken literally, but instead held the key to unlocking your inner energy? Imagine that buried within his words lies a precise map to awaken the third eye, the forgotten gateway to divine consciousness. They never told you this because true spiritual power makes you ungovernable. And now those secrets are surfacing. For centuries, this knowledge was hidden by dogma and buried beneath layers of fear. But it was never lost, just waiting to be remembered by those who could feel the stirrings within. Science dismissed it. Religion twisted it. Yet mystics knew. Kundalini is not new age. It's ancient, sacred, and real. If you've been sensing something deeper calling from within, this is your moment. A moment to unlock the energy they told you to fear. A moment to awaken what's always been sleeping inside you. But only if you're ready. You were never told that one of the most sacred parts of your body is hidden deep inside your brain. Not in the heart, not in the soul, but in the exact center of your head. Ancient mystics called it the seat of the soul, and Jesus may have hinted at it every time he spoke of light, eyes, and seeing beyond the flesh. The question is, what were they really trying to protect? In Matthew 6, verse 22, Jesus says, "If your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light." Most read it and move on without asking, what is this single eye? Today, scientists call it the pineal gland, an almond-shaped structure that responds to light, even though it's buried in darkness. But here's where the mystery deepens. The pineal gland produces melatonin. Yes, but in ancient spiritual traditions, it was far more than a sleep hormone center. It was believed to be the gateway between physical reality and the unseen world. In the Upanishads, in Egyptian rituals, and even in early Gnostic texts, this tiny gland was the bridge between man and the divine. Why did different cultures, isolated by oceans and centuries, all point to the same thing? Modern neuroscience has discovered that the pineal has photoreceptors similar to those found in our actual eyes. It reacts to light, magnetism, and in some experiments, even consciousness itself. Dr. Rick Strassman, in his studies on DMT at the University of New Mexico, proposed that the pineal might be the very point where the soul enters and leaves the body. It is, in his words, a spiritual antenna. But could it also be the hidden lamp that Jesus spoke of? Imagine that for a moment, that deep in your head is a divine lens, dusty from lifetimes of disuse. A sacred gate, covered by forgetfulness, waiting to be reawakened. What would happen if it opened? And what ancient power would surge through you if light truly flooded your entire body? Because this isn't just philosophy anymore. From Brazil to India, modern practitioners of Kundalini yoga report sudden visions, deep inner silence, and strange warmth in the forehead. And across forums like Reddit and YouTube, people share experiences of the blue light behind closed eyes after deep forgiveness or prayer. One woman described it as a soft explosion of peace. And yet, all of this has been quietly dismissed by mainstream religion. They want you to believe it's symbolic. They want you to stay afraid of your own energy. Because when you awaken the eye within, the real one, something irreversible happens. Your perception changes. Your world begins to dissolve. And it's precisely at that point that the illusions can no longer hold. Most people spend their lives looking outward, chasing answers in books, teachers, systems. But what if the real door was never outside you? What if Jesus, in the most overlooked of phrases, was pointing you to the narrowest path? One not between cities, but between your very eyebrows. A path so subtle, so hidden, that only silence could reveal it. In Luke 13, verse 24, he says, "Strive to enter through the narrow door, for many will seek to enter and not be able." Theologians interpreted it as a metaphor for salvation. But those who've walked the inward path know that narrow door is no abstraction. It's real, energetic, precise. It's the thin veil between thought and stillness, located exactly where the third eye rests, at the brow. This isn't speculation. In traditions like Sahaja Yoga, widely practiced in India and Europe, the space at the center of the forehead is activated through breath and a single phrase, "I forgive." Forgiveness isn't just moral, it's vibrational. It's an actual frequency. According to Sahaja founder Sri Mataji, without forgiveness, the door simply won't open, no matter how much you meditate. And here's the twist. She wasn't alone in saying this. Neuroscience backs part of the mystery. A study published in Frontiers in Psychology, Whitley et al., 2001, showed that people who practice forgiveness had significant shifts in the brain's frontal cortex, the same area behind the forehead, directly linked to the pineal gland. Forgiveness reduces limbic activation, meaning less fear, more clarity. And clarity, as mystics say, is the first spark of inner sight. Yet most seekers ignore this completely. They jump into mantras, crystals, psychedelic journeys, all in search of awakening, without ever addressing the heaviness in their heart. But energy cannot rise through a blocked passage. And the third eye does not open through force, it opens through surrender. Not to a God outside you, but to the inner Christ within. Imagine a door locked not by chains, but by regret, guilt, and judgment. Imagine that every grudge you hold is another brick over that sacred entrance. And now imagine that Jesus wasn't warning you, he was guiding you. Not out of fear, but out of precise energetic wisdom. The question is, who listens? Because if that door truly opens, what lies behind it isn't just inner light. It's the end of separation. It's the collapse of duality. It's the moment you stop believing you're a body and start knowing your awareness. But the silence beyond the door speaks only to those who are empty. And it's in that exact silence, when thought vanishes and the self dissolves, that the eye begins to see for the first time. But what it sees may not be what you expect. You were never taught that the story of Christ might also be a story about your own spine. Not just spiritual in metaphor, but literal in energy. Hidden within the ancient scriptures and echoed in mystical traditions is a teaching so strange, so precise, that it was dismissed as heresy and later buried under centuries of ritual. But some still remember, the anointing of the Christ happens inside you. In esoteric circles, particularly those influenced by early Gnostic Christianity and Eastern yogic paths, there is a belief in a sacred substance produced within the body, often referred to as the Christ oil or sacred secretion. This isn't mystical poetry. It refers to a real biological process said to involve the brain, spinal cord, and glands such as the pineal and pituitary. According to mystic George Carey, and expanded upon by contemporary seekers like Santos Bonacci, this oil descends from the brain, travels down the spine, and must be consciously raised again, activating a form of inner resurrection. And the symbolism aligns almost perfectly with the passion story of Jesus. In the gospel stories, Christ is said to be crucified at age 33. The human spine, it has 33 vertebrae. And where does the oil rise again? To the brain, specifically to the optic thalamus, which ancient texts sometimes call the light of the world. This is no accident. The sacred path, in this view, is encoded in your anatomy. It's a hidden blueprint of ascension, a ladder that Jacob saw in his dream, and that yogis today try to climb through breath and awareness. On YouTube, you'll find personal testimonies describing strange experiences during meditative states. Heat rising through the spine, vibrating sensations in the forehead, overwhelming emotions of love or clarity. In one account from a Kundalini practitioner named Angela, posted on the channel Kundalini Diary, she describes a liquid fire moving from the base of her spine to her skull during deep breath work and prayer. Not hallucination, not imagination. She called it the most real thing I've ever felt. And yet, this phenomenon remains dismissed by modern science, perhaps because it cannot be controlled. But what if the sacred secretion is what Jesus meant when he said, "I am in the Father and the Father is in me"? A cyclical movement, a rising and returning. And what if the resurrection story was never just historical, but biochemical, energetic, spiritual? A code, not just for salvation, but for transfiguration. Could it be that the real ascension begins in your spine? Because if the Christ oil is real and it rises through you, it doesn't just light up your brain. It reconfigures your perception. You no longer look at the world, you see through it. And when that moment comes, what you meet at the top of the spine may not be a god, but your true self finally awake. What if the teachings of Jesus were never about morality, but about perception? What if his true message was less about reward and punishment, and more about frequency, vibration, and light? We've long been told that faith is invisible, but recent discoveries in quantum physics suggest that the mind, especially a focused one, is not only visible, but measurable in its impact on reality. Could it be that Jesus was describing quantum consciousness 2,000 years ago? In the Gospel of John, Jesus declares, "I am the light of the world." On the surface, it's poetic, but mystics throughout history believed that light wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. The pineal gland, the so-called third eye, is photoreceptive. It responds to light and, more importantly, to imagined light. This means your inner visions, your thoughts, prayers, and meditative focus can trigger physiological reactions in a gland buried deep in your brain. Modern science once laughed at this. Not anymore. In studies on non-locality, quantum entanglement has shown that particles separated by vast distances still respond instantly to each other's state. This suggests a deeper layer of reality, one not bound by space or time. And here's where it becomes spiritual. Focused human intention has been shown in experiments by Dr. Dean Radin and the Institute of Noetic Sciences to subtly influence systems at a distance. In other words, consciousness might be quantum, and Jesus, in his cryptic phrases about the kingdom being within, may have known this all along. Consider this. If the pineal gland is your inner transmitter, a literal antenna to the field of universal consciousness, then prayer, when done in deep stillness, isn't just devotion. It's signal transmission, energy sent out and received. There are even reports in the scientific literature suggesting that focused meditators show altered EEG patterns, often in the gamma range, indicating synchronization between different parts of the brain. This coherence resembles what mystics call alignment or illumination. And that brings us to a curious phrase Jesus used. When your eye is single, your whole body will be full of light. Single, unified, no longer dual. Quantum physics, too, seeks a unified field theory, a merging of all known forces. Is it possible Jesus wasn't just speaking to the heart, but to the wave function of the universe? That when you quiet the mind, collapse the observer effect, and focus inward, you are aligning yourself with the very force that creates matter. Some modern mystics and spiritual teachers now teach that the light experienced during deep meditation is not imagination, but quantum perception. Not a hallucination, but an encounter with the informational field of reality itself. The pineal gland, acting like a tuning fork, responds to your intent, your breath, your attention. And in that moment of inner silence, something more than thought begins to arise. Something ancient, something remembered. Because once your consciousness touches that field, reality no longer behaves the same way. You begin to see synchronicities everywhere. Your thoughts shape outcomes. Time bends around intention. The world becomes participatory, not fixed. And slowly, the veil between what you see and what is begins to thin. And it's precisely at that threshold, where mind meets matter and silence meets light, that the teachings of Jesus stop being religious and start becoming real. But what you encounter in that space may not be light at all. You felt it. That strange pressure in the middle of your forehead. Maybe a tingling during meditation. Dreams more vivid than ever, filled with symbols that feel ancient and inexplicable. And then come the synchronicities, numbers repeating, people calling just as you think of them, moments that seem scripted by something beyond logic. These are the signs most seekers crave, the ones whispered about in spiritual circles and posted across forums like Reddit's r/awakening or r/pineal gland. They call it an initiation, an awakening, a gift. But here's what almost no one tells you. Without proper grounding, this awakening can become a trap. Because when the third eye opens before your emotional body is ready, it doesn't lead to enlightenment, it leads to fragmentation. A study published by the University of Sao Paulo revealed that more than 80% of participants who had sudden spiritual awakenings also reported heightened anxiety, insomnia, and difficulty distinguishing imagination from perception. One participant, interviewed during a research session by Dr. Maria Cristina de Barros, described seeing auras and shadows constantly, feeling overstimulated and disconnected from her life. What began as beauty quickly became chaos. And yet, this isn't about fear, it's about responsibility. The third eye doesn't just show you light. It reveals the shadows you've avoided for years. It's not just a portal to higher dimensions, but a mirror of your deepest subconscious fears. That's why ancient traditions never treated this as a hobby or weekend experiment. They paired third eye work with daily grounding, breath control, forgiveness rituals, and stillness. In Kundalini yoga, for instance, breath and posture are used not to awaken energy immediately, but to contain it. One of the most overlooked practices is emotional cleansing through forgiveness. In Sahaja Yoga, practitioners are taught to repeat the words, "I forgive everyone, including myself," while placing their hand on the forehead. It sounds simple, but neurologically, it activates the prefrontal cortex and reduces limbic stress. Forgiveness lowers cortisol, stabilizes mood, and prepares the mind to perceive without panic. Without this emotional integration, the visions that come through the third eye can overwhelm your nervous system. That's the trap, the illusion that awakening always leads upward. In truth, it often leads downward first, into the buried wounds, the suppressed fears, the unresolved memories. Awakening means seeing clearly, and that includes the parts of yourself you've avoided. The third eye will show you the divine, yes, but it will also show you what's blocking it. And yet, the real danger isn't the visions. It's what happens when the ego begins to identify with them. When you believe that being awake makes you superior, chosen, untouchable, that's when the fall begins, subtle, quiet, but certain. Because the same eye that sees divine light can also be blinded by illusion. But what if the illusions aren't out there, but within the light itself? What if the third eye reveals not truth, but the final test? And what lies beyond that is something no seeker expects. For centuries, the phrase, "I am the narrow gate," echoed through churches, pulpits, and religious texts, stripped of its original fire. It was taught as a warning, a call to moral discipline, spiritual obedience. But what if that phrase was never meant to scare you, but to awaken you? What if Jesus wasn't speaking of a path outside you, but of a sacred point between your eyes? The narrow gate, mentioned in both Matthew and Luke, is often interpreted as the way to salvation. But in Eastern spiritual traditions, and among Christian mystics like Meister Eckhart, the narrow path refers to the inner passage of the soul. In yogic science, it's the Ajna chakra, located exactly at the center of the brow. It is the meeting point of the dual energies, Ida and Pingala, where silence meets awareness. The gate is narrow because it requires stillness, surrender, and presence. This concept isn't foreign to Christianity. In the writings of the Desert Fathers, early Christian hermits from Egypt and Syria, meditative silence was the key to divine perception. They spoke of watching the light within and placing the mind in the heart, echoing the same internal gaze taught in Eastern traditions. Their descriptions sound almost identical to modern-day third eye awakening, a sense of being filled with light and a complete detachment from mental noise. Even more astonishing, in Sahaja Yoga, a spiritual practice combining elements of Christianity and Hinduism, the third eye is referred to as the Agnya chakra, and its governing force is none other than Jesus himself. According to founder Sri Mataji Nirmala Devi, Jesus' role in the energy system is to dissolve the ego and superego, the dual forces that block the brow center. Only through forgiveness, she said, can this gate open. And when it does, the seeker experiences thoughtless awareness, pure consciousness, untouched by past or future. But here's the paradox. Most people approach the third eye with a desire to see more, visions, spirits, past lives. They seek images, sensations, powers, and yet, the narrow gate only opens when you desire nothing. When you become so still, so empty that the self evaporates. Jesus wasn't inviting you to do anything. He was inviting you to become something, a vessel for divine light. And that light isn't found in what you see, but in what remains when there's nothing left to look at. The gate is not a portal to fantasy. It's a passage through the death of the ego. That's why it's narrow. That's why few enter. Not because they're unworthy, but because they're too full, too distracted, too attached to what they believe awakening should look like. And so they miss the silence between thoughts, the breath between breaths, the eye that sees without form. Because when you finally find that silent center, the space just behind the brow, there is no more question of belief or doubt. There is only knowing. And in that knowing, there is no you left to be saved. And it's in that precise moment, when all effort ceases and the inner gate creaks open, that something enters. Something ancient. Something electric. Something you were never prepared to face. Not every awakening leads to light. Some crack the door too quickly, without preparation, without grounding, and what rushes in isn't clarity, it's chaos. There's a hidden side to the Kundalini experience that few dare to speak of. The side where energy rises but consciousness doesn't follow. And that's where things begin to unravel. Kundalini is not a toy. It is not a trend. It is an intelligent force, a sacred fire coiled at the base of the spine, revered and feared by yogis for millennia. In its balanced ascent, it cleanses, awakens, aligns. But when forced, when triggered prematurely through trauma, psychedelics, or ego-driven practices, it can unleash more than the body or mind is ready to hold. Anxiety, sleeplessness, mental fragmentation, even psychotic breaks. These are not myths, they are documented phenomena. In a study conducted by psychiatrist Dr. Lee Sanella, author of the Kundalini Experience, he analyzed dozens of cases where individuals experienced spontaneous awakenings. Many reported spiritual visions and heightened awareness, yes. But just as many spoke of unbearable inner noise, disturbing imagery, and a loss of personal identity. Without integration, without direction, the energy doesn't purify, it overwhelms. And that's where the teachings of Christ become essential. Why Christ? Because Christ consciousness brings the one thing raw Kundalini lacks, the heart, the forgiveness, the humility, the surrender. In Eastern systems, this heart frequency is called bhakti, devotion. In Christian mysticism, it's the path of the Sacred Heart. Without it, Kundalini rises like fire without shape, consuming rather than illuminating. Christ's message wasn't just about salvation. It was about the refinement of the soul. A soul that could contain power without being destroyed by it. There's a post on Reddit, in the Kundalini subreddit, from a woman named Lara. She described her awakening as a beautiful nightmare. It began with light and warmth. It ended with isolation and fear. She admitted to diving into breath work and psychedelics without guidance. I was chasing divinity, she wrote, but I forgot to become love first. That one sentence holds a wisdom more powerful than any technique. Energy without love is just voltage. The danger isn't Kundalini itself. It's approaching it with a fractured psyche, an inflated ego, or a need to feel special. Awakening isn't about becoming more. It's about becoming less. Less reactive, less attached, less separate. Christ consciousness doesn't suppress the fire. It cools it, shapes it, gives it purpose. And when that divine energy flows through a heart softened by compassion, it becomes light, not heat. But if you awaken this force without the anchor of the heart, without Christ's frequency, not the man, but the vibration, the fire can burn through your sense of self. You might touch the infinite, yes, but lose your ability to function. And what remains after that? Because beyond the bright visions and sacred symbols, there's a threshold no one talks about. A place where the energy no longer just rises, it begins to speak. And what it whispers there can either liberate your soul or consume it. They told you the cross was wood, a symbol of sacrifice, punishment, and divine forgiveness. But what if the cross Jesus spoke of was not just a piece of timber, but a structure you carry within you every single day? What if his invitation to take up your cross and follow me was a hidden directive, to activate the spine as the path of resurrection? Every ancient tradition speaks of a central energy channel rising along the human spine. In yoga, it's called the Sushumna Nadi, the highway of Kundalini. In Taoist alchemy, it's the thrusting vessel. And in Christian mysticism, though mostly erased or metaphorized, the idea remains, as the ladder Jacob saw in his dream, or the straight path Paul hints at. This vertical line, from the base of the spine to the crown of the head, is more than anatomical, it's spiritual architecture. And here's where it gets uncanny. The spine has 33 vertebrae. Jesus is said to have been crucified at age 33. Coincidence? Or code? Esoteric teachers like Manly P. Hall believed the crucifixion was a symbolic message about the elevation of consciousness through the spinal channel, a metaphor for the sacred oil, or inner Christ, rising to the brain. From the sacrum, the sacred bone at the base, to the optic thalamus, where light floods perception, this journey is not linear, it's alchemical. In meditative traditions, particularly in advanced Kundalini work, practitioners often report sensations that defy explanation. Warmth climbing the back, pressure at the base of the skull, electric tingling across the shoulders. These aren't random side effects. They're energetic milestones. They mirror what many mystics described as the inner ascent, a path walked not with the feet, but with the breath, the will, and the purified heart. So what did Jesus really mean when he said, "Whoever does not carry their own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple"? What if carrying the cross meant activating this inner current, facing the weight of your own lower self, and allowing energy to rise, vertebra by vertebra, through discipline and surrender? In this view, the crucifixion becomes an internal transformation, the ego nailed, the old self dissolved, so that spirit may ascend. But this path isn't for the curious, it's for the courageous, because the spine is not just a channel, it's a vault. It stores every unspoken emotion, every tension, every memory unprocessed. And as the energy rises, those buried fragments are shaken loose. The awakening isn't peaceful at first. It burns, it purifies, it unmasks. That's why few finish the path. Not because it's hidden, but because it's hard. And yet, for those who endure, there's a moment. A moment when the energy touches the top and silence explodes into knowing. When time collapses and you no longer believe in spirit, you are it. But what happens in that instant, when energy kisses light and the cross becomes a crown, is not salvation. It's something much more dangerous. It's freedom. And that's where everything begins to change. You've heard that the journey is inward. That silence leads to truth. But what if the path to awakening wasn't just mystical, but measurable? What if what Jesus, the yogis, and the mystics all described in metaphors is now being tracked by machines, sensors, and electrodes? In the quiet, in the breath, something happens, and science is finally catching up. The HeartMath Institute, after decades of research, discovered something profound. When the mind and heart enter a state of coherence, rhythmically aligned, emotionally balanced, the body emits a measurable electromagnetic field. And that field can influence the world around it. Through techniques like heart-focused breathing and deep emotional awareness, practitioners can shift their entire physiology. But more than that, they can unlock what ancient mystics called divine perception, a state where the veil begins to thin. And where is this alignment felt? In the center of the chest and in the center of the brow. The pineal gland and the heart, though distant in anatomy, pulse together when coherence is achieved. Neuroscientists like Dr. Joe Dispenza have demonstrated through EEG scans that when individuals enter deep meditative states, the pineal begins to emit rhythmic, gamma-level frequencies, often linked to mystical experience, euphoria, and nonlinear awareness. At the same time, the heart enters a state of resonance. It's not imagination, it's a measurable symphony. Ancient traditions knew this. The Egyptians called the heart Ib, the seat of memory and moral awareness. In Christian scripture, Jesus repeatedly speaks not just of the mind, but of the heart. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Not think God, see Him. This was never about belief. It was about perception aligned through inner balance, the union of feeling and focus, spirit and structure. And what brings the two into harmony? Forgiveness, emotional release, breath, stillness. In clinical psychology, heart coherence practices have been shown to reduce anxiety, regulate emotions, and enhanced decision making. But for mystics, those same effects are just the beginning. The real purpose is transformation, to become a vessel through which divine intelligence flows, not sporadically, but steadily. When the mind and heart sync, the veil thins, and the eye that was always blind begins to open. People often seek visions, downloads, supernatural experiences, but the doorway doesn't open through intensity. It opens through coherence, through rhythm, through surrender. That's why Jesus never taught formulas. He taught frequencies. Peace, forgiveness, compassion. These weren't just virtues, they were vibrational keys. And when those keys are used, when the heart softens and the brow stills, something clicks. Something subtle, a pulse, a knowing, a flicker of light behind the eyes that doesn't come from sight, but from presence. But there's a moment right at the center of that harmony when the energy begins to shift direction. And in that moment, if you're still enough to feel it, you realize you're not syncing with your own body. You're syncing with something much older and far more intelligent than anyone ever dared to admit. You were told to choose either the path of the East or the path of the West, either chakras or the cross. But what if that separation was artificial? What if the very rituals whispered in sacred temples and the parables spoken on Galilean hillsides were never meant to be divided? What if combining Kundalini practices with the teachings of Christ isn't rebellion, but restoration? For centuries, religious institutions warned against blending traditions. Mixing mantras with prayer was seen as dangerous, even blasphemous. But beneath the surface of doctrine, mystics knew better. In both Kundalini yoga and Christian mysticism, there exists a central current, the journey inward, the rising energy, the sacred light. In one tradition, it's Shakti. In the other, the Holy Spirit. Two names, one force. Two languages, one experience. And those who've dared to bridge the divide are starting to speak out. On the YouTube channel Sacred Secretion, spiritual researcher Santos Bonacci explains how ancient Christian rituals mirror yogic energy practices, from the breathing patterns of Gregorian chants to the laying on of hands over energy centers. Even the anointing with oil, performed in early Christian baptism, can be seen as symbolic activation of the third eye. The ritual wasn't decorative, it was energetic. In the words of mystic teacher Sri Mataji, Jesus resides at the Agnya chakra, the energy center at the brow. In Sahaja Yoga, which harmonizes Eastern and Christian views, this center is the gate through which thought must be silenced. And who holds the key? Christ. Forgiveness is the vibration that opens it. Not belief, not dogma, not fear, but actual energetic release. A physiological change triggered through spiritual alignment. So what happens when you begin to pray while focusing on the third eye? When you speak Our Father while seated in stillness, spine upright, breath aligned, something shifts. The words stop being recitations. They become currents. Your body becomes a temple, not metaphorically, but biologically. And the ritual, long buried under centuries of repetition, begins to awaken its original purpose, transformation. This is what they feared. Not sin, not heresy, but synthesis. Because when East and West unite inside your body, when Jesus walks the spine and Shakti rises to meet him, you are no longer bound by religion. You are bound to source. And at that point, no institution can claim ownership over your soul. But there's a moment in that fusion when breath, prayer, and presence merge that a new kind of current begins to move. And once that current rises through the brow, it doesn't stop at light. It opens a door that hasn't been walked through in centuries. And what waits on the other side was never written in any book. I didn't plan for any of it to happen. I wasn't meditating in a cave or following a strict discipline. I was just sitting quietly one night, trying to forgive someone who had broken me in a way I couldn't speak about. No incense, no music, just breath and a strange heaviness behind my eyes that I hadn't noticed before. Then, all at once, something shifted. It felt like a wave of warmth rising from the base of my spine, curling inward like smoke and moving toward my forehead. Not a vision, not a hallucination, but a presence. And then a flash. Not of light in the physical sense, but of clarity. I suddenly understood the pain. Not just mine, but his. It was like compassion erupted behind my eyes. I had never felt that before. I wasn't looking for mysticism, but mysticism came anyway. I later learned that this was a known experience described by people across cultures and timelines. The pineal gland activating through emotional release, not just through technique. Psychologist Dr. Stephen Porges has written extensively on how compassion and forgiveness directly stimulate the vagus nerve, leading to deep parasympathetic states. That means calm, regulation, peace. But those states, they're also the entry point to mystical awareness. They prime the body to perceive subtle energies that are always there, just normally drowned out by inner noise. After that night, everything changed. Not in a dramatic, lightning bolt way, but subtly, like fog lifting from my thoughts. I started noticing patterns in people's words, in the timing of things. I stopped reacting so much. There was a space between stimulus and response, and in that space, I felt connected. I've since learned to revisit that state through breath work and forgiveness, not to chase a high, but to return to that alignment. And the most shocking part? It wasn't rare. When I started sharing this online, I found dozens of others with almost identical stories. A man from Chile who practiced nightly forgiveness and began having lucid dreams filled with symbols he'd never studied. A woman from Portugal who said she saw a blue duck of love floating behind her eyelids after praying for someone who had abused her. These weren't spiritual gurus. These were ordinary people who had touched something extraordinary through compassion. None of them were chasing power. None were seeking visions. They simply opened their hearts in deep sincerity, and the eye opened in return. That's when I realized the third eye doesn't respond to effort. It responds to truth. You don't force it open with mantras or crystals. You uncover it, like a lens buried under layers of resentment, fear, and noise. But there's a moment in that uncovering, a moment so quiet it's almost imperceptible, when the inner vision begins to flicker. And in that flicker, in the stillness between thoughts, you see something staring back at you. Not a light, but a memory of who you've always been. In today's spiritual circles, the name of Jesus is often avoided or distorted. You'll hear about chakras, crystals, and cosmic beings, but not about the man who walked barefoot through deserts, speaking of inner light and the kingdom within. Somehow he became too religious for the new age, yet his original message was anything but. It was raw, mystical, and deeply subversive. Many modern seekers dismiss Christ's teachings as outdated, incompatible with their ideas of manifestation and energy. But this couldn't be further from the truth. In fact, most forget that Jesus spoke more about vibration than any other concept, though he used different words. Those who have ears, let them hear. The kingdom of God is within you. You are the light of the world. These aren't metaphors, they're energetic truths. But only if you're willing to strip away the cultural layers. There's a growing movement online, across forums like Reddit's r/Christian mysticism, and even inside spiritual YouTube communities, of people re-encountering Christ through direct experience, not dogma. They describe moments of peace so profound it silences the mind. Visions of gold light during deep prayer. Emotional healings triggered not by law of attraction techniques, but by surrender, service, and forgiveness. These aren't fantasy. They're real events, reported by people who never set foot in a church. And what separates Christ's path from many trending spiritual ideologies is this: it doesn't center you. It dissolves you. Where the modern spiritual world says manifest your desires, Christ says lose yourself to find yourself. Where the new age promises power, he offers surrender. Where others seek visions, he speaks through silence. And in that silence, something more sacred is found, not sensation, but truth. This is why mystics like Thomas Merton, Saint Teresa of Avila, and even non-Christians like Rumi all touched the same stream. A stream not of cosmic games or psychic abilities, but of a deep and radical stillness. A consciousness that doesn't speak in signs or affirmations, but in the very texture of reality itself. Christ was never about belief. He was about presence, a kind so total, it made entire crowds fall silent in his wake. But here's the challenge: most people aren't looking for silence. They're looking for fireworks. And that's the trap. Not all that glows is light. Not all energy is sacred. Just because something feels powerful doesn't mean it liberates you. In fact, the most liberating truths are often the softest, the ones that don't impress, but transform. And it's in that gentle unraveling, when the self stops seeking and starts listening, that the presence of Christ reveals itself, not in form, not in dogma, but in the way the stillness behind your breath suddenly feels alive. And from that stillness, something begins to speak, but it does not use words. We're told that forgiveness is moral, that it's something you do to be a better person. But science and mystics say otherwise. Forgiveness is not just a virtue, it's a frequency. And when practiced with sincerity, it doesn't just heal your emotions, it shifts your biology, deeply, visibly, and perhaps even cosmically. Neuroscience now confirms what ancient teachings have hinted at for centuries, that the act of forgiving rewires the brain. In studies by Dr. Frederick Luskin at Stanford University, forgiveness training led to decreased blood pressure, reduced stress hormones, and improved brain coherence. More specifically, it increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, the very region associated with the pineal gland. This is not a metaphor. It's measurable. Forgiveness softens the brain's defenses and opens its internal channels. But why does this matter to spiritual awakening? Because the pineal gland, that silent light receptor deep within your brain, cannot activate in a field of stress. Fear, resentment, and inner conflict cloud the body's electromagnetic balance. In contrast, forgiveness creates coherence, emotional clarity, and in that clarity, the pineal, long dormant, begins to vibrate. Not dramatically, not like a bolt of lightning, but like the quiet hum of an engine starting from deep within. Jesus didn't say believe, and you will be enlightened. He said forgive, and you will be forgiven. And those words hold more than spiritual weight. They carry energetic precision. In Sahaja Yoga, the Agnya Chakra, the brow center, cannot open without forgiveness. Not because of dogma, but because unforgiveness literally blocks the energetic current rising toward the third eye. In other words, the door remains locked until the heart softens. That's why many people who chase visions, psychic abilities, or altered states hit a wall. They meditate, fast, breathe, and nothing happens. The problem isn't the practice. It's the resistance, the anger, the pain that remains buried and unspoken. And the moment they begin to release it, through sincere forgiveness, not forced, they report sudden surges of clarity, warmth behind the eyes, vibrations in the skull, the sensation of light from within, often described in Christian mysticism and modern DMT experiences alike. This isn't theory. It's happening in labs, in clinics, in monasteries, and in bedrooms across the world. A woman named Sophia, featured in a neuroscience-based documentary on spiritual awakening, shared how after a decade of failed meditations, she simply wrote a forgiveness letter to her estranged father, and the next morning woke up in tears, overwhelmed by a calm she described as radiant silence. That night, she dreamt of a door opening in her forehead, because the pineal gland doesn't respond to force. It responds to truth. And when the emotional body is finally free, not just numbed, but truly free, the third eye doesn't just open, it remembers. It remembers a light so familiar, it hurts. And in that light, you don't see the world differently. You see yourself for the very first time. There comes a moment in the inner path when something shifts. You're not sure exactly when it happened, but the world no longer feels quite the same. You begin to sense people's intentions before they speak. Silence becomes magnetic, and every now and then, you catch yourself smiling for no reason at all. These are signs, subtle, profound, that the Christ light within you has begun to awaken. This light is not metaphorical. It's an energetic field, a conscious intelligence that begins to emanate through your body once the heart, mind, and brow come into harmony. In mystical Christianity, this has been described as the Gloria interior, the inner glory. In modern science, it corresponds with heightened gamma brainwave activity, heart-brain coherence, and pineal resonance. When this field awakens, you don't just feel lighter, you become light in motion. But here lies the paradox. the more awakened you feel, the more subtle the ego becomes. And this is the trap few talk about. Because once you've tasted the inner light, it's easy to believe you've arrived, that you've transcended, evolved, become chosen. This silent pride is far more dangerous than doubt. Why? Because it cloaks itself in spiritual language. You start thinking you're beyond others, beyond correction, beyond the human. Spiritual teacher Ram Dass once said, "Ego can hide in the robes of the guru." And he was right. The same light that softens the soul can inflate it if there's no inner humility. That's why ancient mystics were obsessed with grounding, physical tasks, silence, service. They knew the light wasn't an end, it was an invitation. And the only way to keep it flowing was to stop owning it. You don't have the Christ light. You host it. And if you make it about yourself, it leaves. Psychologist and spiritual mentor DRA Frances Pasternak has warned in her teachings that many who awaken spiritually enter what she calls a floating illusion, a state where the person becomes emotionally detached, overly intellectual, and disconnected from their humanity. Instead of living the light, they start performing it, saying all the right words, but feeling nothing. Their feet leave the ground, and so does their truth. That's why if you felt the Christ light even once, your next step isn't more rituals or seeking. It's anchoring, journaling, creating, serving, returning to your body. Because the light doesn't want to be admired. It wants to move through you. It wants to heal through your hands, speak through your presence, and love through your stillness. And if you hold it too tightly, it will burn you from the inside. But there's a moment in that burn, that sacred fire within the brow, where something else begins to rise. Not light, not love, but a question. So ancient, it unravels everything you thought you were. So the third eye opens. The Christ light awakens. You've touched stillness, seen energy, felt the pulse of something vast beating behind your own thoughts. But now what? That's the question no one prepares you for. Because awakening isn't the end, it's the threshold. The point where mysticism meets responsibility, where insight becomes action, and the true mission begins. Those who've truly opened the inner, I don't retreat into mountains or collect followers. They become ordinary again, but with extraordinary presence. Like the teacher in Brazil, who quietly weaves forgiveness rituals into her classroom and watches her students calm without understanding why. Or the ex-soldier in the US who uses his breath practice, learned through years of inner discipline, to soothe PTSD patients in group therapy. Neither of them preaches. They live the frequency. That's what the Christ path demands, not spectacle, but embodiment. The softest light often moves through the most unassuming people. In the ancient Hermetic texts, it is said, as above, so below. But few remember the second part, as within, so without. When your inner world aligns, the outer begins to reflect it. Synchronicities are no longer just signs. They are confirmations that your vibration is active, shaping the field around you. And that field responds, faster than ever. Because when the third eye remains open, not as a moment, but as a state, your thoughts are no longer background noise. They become blueprints, and reality listens. But this power isn't given to inflate your name or fulfill desires. It's given to serve, not from duty, but from alignment. And if you don't listen, if you keep the energy for yourself sealed and unused, it fades. Because energy must move. It demands direction. It asks for impact. And at the very edge of this realization, where energy becomes purpose and light becomes path, something ancient begins to stir in your heart. Not a message, not a goal, but a memory of the reason you came here at all.